the last year's been tough on people, and I've used my skills I've learned from hosting a podcast to continue the conversation with them and know when they're struggling and understand what I can do to help them without that anxious kind of nervousness around a taboo subject that people don't always want to talk about. But you have to accept that we are sometimes someone else's safe space.
Welcome back to another episode of the WazaMedia Podcast. My name is JR. I'm the CEO of this company. If this is your first time here, WazaMedia is a digital marketing agency out in the Washington, D.C. area where we believe in the power of storytelling. I am super excited to have an awesome guest on the show today. We have Gareth Nock is joining us today. Gareth, thanks for being on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor, and glad to be here, and glad to share a little bit of what I'm up to, and with hope that impacts other people. So
awesome. And we have our friends at the Bo and Luke show to thank for introducing us. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be here talking. And the power of community and networking is what brought us here. So we have them to thank. So thank you, Bo and Luke, for introducing us together.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just speaks volumes about the podcast community as a whole, and how it's really taught me to kind of reach out and build better connections with the realization that there's a receiving ear on the end of it, which has just been an amazing kind of part of my last couple of years. So
and definitely in the last year, we've seen the podcast community grow as an entire industry and as an entire platform. We're seeing audio clearly take off across at scale across multiple platforms and such, which has been great. It's been nice to be able to have different outlets to gain information, to communicate with people over the last year, just because of the global pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that touch on the selfish endeavor of a podcast, which is that learning and growing, and definitely something I've benefited from. And, all of the listeners of all of the shows out there are benefiting too. So it's awesome.
Gareth, before we kind of dive into the purpose of why you're here, I was wondering if, as WazaMedia believes in the power of story, I was wondering if, could you give us a little bit about your story before we kick off?
Absolutely, I can. I'm again very passionate about the storytelling, and I love that part of what I get to do every day. So I can give you the real kind of snapshot. So right now I'm turning 40 this year. So the last 40 years in a snapshot. Grew up in England. I grew up there till I was about 25 years old. Kind of went through south of London. Grew up, moved around with my parents a lot, went through some big struggles in my teen years, being very unhealthy, very overweight, very isolated. And that led me to this journey of becoming a fitness professional, which was an interesting U-turn for someone that struggled with that as a kid. But it taught me a lot about myself, and jumped into it at like 17 and still doing it now. So we're 21, 22 years nearly. And it just set me on this course of discovery. And it was a slow process, but it walked me through this place I didn't feel I deserved to be and didn't belong. And then I kind of grew and molded into this place that I did feel like I belonged eventually. And that kind of led me down the path of my self-development, learning, growing, moving around the world. So currently based in Canada, so just north of Toronto, but I've spent a couple of times living here, out in New Zealand as well, living, working. Went out there kind of just after I got married to my wife, and we kind of went traveling and lived and worked, and then back to Canada. And the fitness has been the constant for me, the fitness industry, my personal journey through fitness, but also being a coach and through leadership has always been that constant. And it's kind of it's almost been my best friend the whole way through that journey. And then ended up back in Canada, and now very happily settled in a lovely little town with my wife and my 4-year-old daughter. And then through my connections, through the co-host and founder of the podcast, I met Carl, and we kind of went down this podcast journey. And now we have some more hosts and this amazing platform. So that's really that's the Coles Notes, couple of minutes short version, but it kind of takes you on a bit of a journey through me.
Awesome. And I've been listening to your podcast, and and we'll talk more about your podcast, because you've your podcast and your team, and it's definitely a team effort. Especially with your new addition,
Yeah.
being able to kind of diversify some of the topics and things. We're definitely going to go into it. Because the one thing I really want to talk to you about today is about how we as built your community. And the podcast goes through a lot of different topics, and it's not just surface level topic. You guys go deep.
Yeah.
And I'm going to name a couple of these topics because I was listening to one of them. The one of them was about the 13-year-old with cancer.
Yep.
That was an interesting one. I do like the ones about parenting, and then also men's mental health, which is one of the TV spots that I found out that you guys had, and you guys got to go onto Canadian TV and did a morning spot about that. So that was really cool. So one thing I like about your podcast with your team is that you don't go surface level. You dive into to these deep issues, something that might scare a lot of people on a daily. It's not everyday conversation stuff.
Yeah. It for sure it does, and that was a journey for all of us. Right from the very start of the podcast. So we're called We As now, but we were We As Men, and then We As Dads, We As Women, We As Difference Makers, and we added these many platforms, and we all went on our own journey. We all started that journey, and you touched on community a little bit, and we consider our community every guest, every listener, and anyone that's involved. So we all started on a journey of kind of finding our inner circle and finding those people to come on the show and talk, people that we could dive deep with. And we just found out there was a real appetite for that. And I originally was a guest on We As Men with Carl, and just that I put that show out there, and it was probably the most vulnerable I've ever been. I've been that vulnerable with him as a very close friend, but not putting it out on the internet for the world. But it started this trickle down of I can talk about this more, and there was a big appetite, and there was lots of people reaching out and connecting about the show and wanting to know more, which led me into wanting to start to record and host. And the community kind of built from there. Every conversation you have, every not a direct connection, but that secondary connection you reach out to that's interested, and then that third connection, and then suddenly you've got a TV spot. And we've got we connected with the amazing organization that is Tether for Men. They saw us on, their CEO saw us on TV and connected us that way. We've had all these amazing the episode you referenced just a moment ago with the 13-year-old with cancer. He's connected to the Tether community, as are many of our guests, and it was almost, I want to say we did this great, amazing effort to build a community, but we almost just had vulnerable conversations, created permission for other people. And because of that, this community just it was just like a truck drove into it. It wasn't like planned, or it just grew, and it just blew up in that manner. And we had all these people coming in, and we've just recently added Aaliyah as a host. So myself, Carl, and Scott have been kind of in and around, and Aaliyah's come on board because she was a guest. She was connected to me. She loved what we were doing. So it's a very organic process, I think, is what I'm trying to say. It wasn't something we went out to do. We just went out to record episodes, and this organic community just grew as a result of it.
That's awesome. And the topics are really, really what I feel sets apart your podcast from some of the other ones that I dive to on a daily basis. So I'm really thankful that that you took the step and the courage to be vulnerable, and that's how it got to where you are today. And being able to open up about very deep topics is great, and it really takes a lot of courage. The other part about men's mental health and how we've had discussions on this on the back end, other than here, about parenting and us, both of us being fathers, and how that's kind of made us who we are today. It's part of our mold. And I haven't really talked to a lot of people about that. So that sense of vulnerability really kind of puts you out there. And I think this medium, this podcast platform is a great way, an intimate way to get that out there. And the other part is the next step is when it goes out on the internet for the whole world to know about it.
Yeah, well, and you're about to experience that in the next few weeks or so, when we get your episode out. But it's we always refer. This is something we kind of stumbled across in a conversation, I think, between the kind of the hosts, that we find that vulnerability is like a handshake, and not we're doing a lot of that right now with COVID, but when you have to be able to be vulnerable, but you need to be in a place where it's accepted. Because if you approach vulnerability, or if you become vulnerable in a situation and it's not met with acceptance, no judgment, and not accepted with that kind of space that we're needed, it then kind of pushes that back to the person, presenting that vulnerability. And then every time we do that, it forces us back a little bit on our journey. So it's about, we live by the motto of surround yourself. And if you surround yourself with people that can meet you in that handshake of vulnerability, you'll equally, as you just described, be able to express that vulnerability and be able to connect with that person. And that's basically our platform. Like we do such a great job of reviewing ourselves as hosts and creating that inclusive, safe space where we can accept vulnerability as well as present vulnerability. And that's a cornerstone of what we're doing.
I love it. And other than the podcast, are you able to take your community onto, how do you continue conversations about the things that you talk about, mental health, parenting, dealing with cancer? How are you able to continue these conversations outside the podcast? Because that is a kind of a limited area, but with your community, how are you able to continue these conversations?
We lean fairly heavily on social media, so we're using Instagram, Facebook, and they're kind of our two platforms that we're focusing in, and we're continuing those conversations through those channels right now. But also, I think the greater conversation is opportunities like getting to go on TV and talk about men's mental health. We had a great collaboration back in November, and this is an ongoing collaboration where we team up with Movember. So we grow our mustaches and we raise money, but we're also bringing on ambassadors of the show. So if anyone listening goes back and looks at the November episodes, you'll hear people in there that are cancer survivors. You're going to hear people that are ambassadors that work alongside Movember. I had a great guy called Adam Hurley on the show, who is a principal of an academy in Toronto, and basically he was addressing the kind of men's mental health and his experiences with cancer and his family, and just these amazing people that are all ambassadors that are raising money. So we're continuing that conversation by connecting. And it's yes, we're having the conversation. Yes, we do speak to the odd listener, and we extend those conversations with guests like yourself, and we build these communities. But I think when we are able to touch more people, like we collaborated with Tether, and Tether are an amazing. So you can check them out. Tether for Men. They have an awesome app, and it's all about men's mental health. They're creating a community and a safe space, and we're very fortunate that they populate our content through their app. So when we have these amazing conversations, especially when they're geared around men's mental health, because that's Tether's kind of area, is we're putting those episodes out and we're being able to reach more people. And as I said, we're getting a lot of guests and a lot of feedback from that. So we're continuing those conversations. And I think that's on a very macro level, and I can talk about that on a very macro level, but on a very personal level, the conversation continues with people in my circle, with that vulnerability and meeting new people, and just finding people through the podcast community, but just people within my world. Like I'm like I said, I'm very fortunate to work in the fitness industry every day. I have great clients, and the last year's been tough on people, and I've used my skills I've learned from hosting a podcast to continue the conversation with them and know when they're struggling and understand what I can do to help them without that anxious kind of nervousness around a taboo subject that people don't always want to talk about. But you have to accept that we are sometimes someone else's safe space. So that's kind of where it's continuing and trickling through the world.
I love how you're able to bridge the type of engagement that's normally done on digital platforms and use it in an in-person environment. I think that's great. And then you also mentioned earlier about how you're able to just go beyond the podcast and use other mediums. You've used local media to get your word out there and to get people connected. So you're using the podcast, you're using social media, and then you're using traditional methods. And it's just, I'm just really astounded by all the deep, and I've said it earlier, the sensitivities and the very deep nature of the topics that you guys go about is really awesome. Um, and these are not easy subjects. For everyone who's listening to the show, you need to subscribe. We're going to do some plugs at the end for how you can subscribe to the podcast. But yes, you need to subscribe. Um, Gareth, I want to talk about what you do with your audience, as we know, with every community, there might be people who are a good fit and there are some that are not. And I know with a lot of communities, we're trying to be inclusive, but we know that sometimes someone may not be a good fit. What is your ideal person for the type of community that you and your team is trying to build?
That's an amazing question. So I would like to be super inclusive and say everyone. However, maybe it isn't for everybody. And what I will say is there is no holds barred on our show. Like, we talk about sexual abuse, we talk about, like you said, cancer. We talk about, I just recently had an amazing man on the show that's been in a gang and been in prison and tried to kill himself. And so we're talking about things that are very sensitive for people. So I would say if you've got some triggers around certain subjects, be sure to check out the show notes and just be aware of those things. But that being said, we all have different triggers, and there's things I listen to that trigger me and, what's been imprinted on me in my life. However, as a host of a podcast, I try to step into those communities without judgment. And, I will, full disclaimer, you tune into any one of our episodes, you're going to hear curse words throughout. It's not, there's no filter. We tell our guests, you speak the way you speak, and I'm not willing to filter somebody else. Obviously we have our limits as we're inclusive, so we're very careful about how we're selecting people. And but yeah, we kind of open up to all beliefs. Like, we have many different people on there. We have conversations about religion. I had a recent conversation about death and ending a life, and and how we walk through that journey. And that's a great episode that's coming out in a couple of weeks. And so there's real touchy things, and it goes into many things that aren't necessarily my beliefs and my belief systems, but we're trying to, I think as hosts, we're trying to show that we're a judgment-free place, and you can come on and you can talk, and there's a couple of very solid boundaries. But we do have people come on and they do talk about religion, they do talk about politics, they do talk about things, and we kind of open it up for that and just allow people to express as they are. Doesn't mean we have to agree with everything. And I think that's what I'm trying to say, is our community is inclusive of everybody, but don't expect to come in and hear only what you believe and only what you think, because there's going to be 250 episodes. You already mentioned the diversity. We've had literally so many people from every walk of life, and you're going to hear about non-binary identifying individuals. You're going to hear about, people from the LGBTQ community. You're going to hear, like I said, about spirituality, religion. You're going to hear about suicide. So if you are ready to grow and change your world as a result of hearing these conversations, then step into our community. Be open to what you hear, even if you don't agree with everything, because what I've learned is when we expose ourselves to other ways of thinking, even if they not align with our belief systems, it broadens the lens in which we see the world through. And I think that's what we can do for anyone. So everyone's welcome, but be prepared to have your lens widened a little bit and see the world maybe through a different light.
That's great. And the beauty about your podcast is how versatile you can be with the different subjects and the different topics. With WazaMedia, for this podcast, mainly we focus on communications. Both my business partner and I we have communications backgrounds. I also have a nursing background. So for this podcast, we try to kind of keep the niche regarding communicating, building communities, tactics, and stuff related in that realm. But with your platform and the audience that you've built, you can just go where you can go in many different places where this for this one that this podcast can't go. And I like how broad, but you've put certain certain parameters with it, but that doesn't restrict you on the types of topics. And listening to the various subjects you've had, it really allows different subjects to come in, and you can go into different layers within that subject. So I think that's great for that, and also and how you can build community. You can even build micro communities within the community. So we were talking about layers earlier, and you could build layers on that, like a burrito, because layers have burritos. Yeah, burritos are good.
Delicious.
Delicious.
There's so many. so many layers, like you said, those micro communities and those connections, and like you said, just podcasting, the wider world of podcasting has built so many of those things. And we just edited a show that is going up this week that I was working on today, and speaking to an amazing guy down in the States, Christian Lopez, and we were just and that was just we connected. We were on a men's group. We was talking about his podcast. I was on there too, and I'm like, so I instantly messaged him. We were on Zoom, so I could send him a private message. I'm like, when are we recording on my show? And it's just those things where, I wouldn't, in my world, that's not something I would do other than the 2 years ago. And it's just those things. And now I've got this great connection. We're messaging back and forward. We developed a good relationship through recording. And it's just those, like you said, right? It's those little micro bits, on a selfish level. And I'm sure there's many other things that are happening. We've had guests on, we've connected them with other guests, and we're building all those little communities. And it's like you said, and what I was just thinking when you were talking is there's that very specific nature podcast. And when you do your research, obviously we do our research, we live in the world of podcasting, there's a lot of research to suggest when you're very broad in your topic that it's a turn off for some people, because they're tuning in to listen to something specific. And we're putting out 3 guest shows, up to like 6 hours of podcasts a week. So it sometimes that's a turn off for some people, and we understand that. However, we live by wanting to change the world one conversation at a time, and that means being open to everything. And we do have, you'll hear, you've listened to some shows, and hopefully some of you listening now will tune in and grab a couple of those shows and have a listen. We have a diving off point. We have a lot of things like personal development coaches, and we have a lot of people in their world that are really showing up as the best version of themselves. So we have that kind of diving off point of a topic. But like I always say, people always message me, so what are we talking about? I'm like, I don't know. But I'm going to start with probably one question, and then we're just going to go where it goes. And you've experienced that yourself, JR, so you know what it's like. But that's how I like to host a show, and it just creates this beautiful, natural conversation. And although it's very non-specific, and some people are like, however, we do think we do a great job of naming the shows and doing great show notes, so you can really pick out what appeals to you. So, even if you're not going to listen to 6 hours a week of us rambling on, you might choose one great show that you want to tune into, and that will be your show for the week. So yeah, it's an interesting world to navigate, because there is so much diversity in podcasting. But yeah, we think we found the sweet spot of, getting those conversations out there.
And you have 250 episodes under your belt, so you've got some credibility to say that. Speaking of 250 episodes and under your belt, I do. We talked about the community that you built over time, and the networks that you've built, the relationships, and the topics. Gareth, I want to ask you, if you could go back in time, and you were to rebuild this community with Carl again, what is something that you would do differently? It could be anywhere with, you want to do growth, or is there a different topic that you wanted to steer that you would do, or was there something else that a missed opportunity to build a connection that you would want to partner with to help grow your community? So to repeat the question, if you could go back in time, what would you do differently?
Wow, great question. So I'm a big believer that we end up where we're meant to be in life. So I'm not going to go as far to say I have an allergic reaction to the question, because I don't. But initially, my response is that I don't know if I'd do anything different, because I love where we're at as a show. However, if I could adjust a few things on the journey, there would be a few things. And this is going to be all probably based around me and my ego. But as a host, I would have definitely had a little more bravery if I knew where we were going to be. Now, with the amount of listeners and downloads and shows that we have, I would have been a bit braver at the beginning. I would have jumped on this way sooner. With everyone in the journey, so with Carl and also Scott and now Aaliyah, is we're all going through this journey together, and we've all and I see similarities in their journey to mine. But yeah, I think I would have just been a bit braver. I would have jumped in. I didn't jump into the amazing guest shows that I'm having now, and I maybe missed a few opportunities, which hopefully I'll get back in the future. I wish I would have been a bit braver with just saying, being authentic. So I think I recorded it in an authentic way, but to be able to just say to the guest, hey, you want to come on the show? Great. I'm going to pick one thing we're going to dive into, and then we're just going to go for this organic conversation, as opposed to that bullet point nature and being a little less in the conversation. So when I'm very much, if I'm in a scripted world and I'm reading, I don't feel that connection. Whereas sometimes I want the best podcasts I record are the ones where I forget I'm recording a podcast. I just think I'm having a conversation with a friend. So there's the beauty of it. And I hope that anyone that listens to the show will hear that in what we're doing. If you go back a couple of years ago and listen to the show, you may not feel that, but that's definitely where it is for me. And I do some solo shows on the show. We do some kind of like just with the hosts, and we do some of that fun stuff as well, but it never feels like it's got that. It's like you're in the room listening to two people have a conversation, and that's what, kind of fills my cup. So I would have just been a bit braver, and I would have jumped into it at the beginning. And, I think if we'd done that, the only other thing I was going to say is if we could have partnered with some of the amazing people that we've partnered with earlier to just get that impact and improve that impact, because I'm very impatient and I want to have more impact now. Yesterday. So yeah, we would have done that, but maybe that the first point would have led us to the second point sooner if I'd jumped in with that amount and kind of had a bit more self-belief and a bit more self-confidence. And if you listen back to me on the show and when I was a guest on We As Men, which is in our catalog way back like 2 years ago, you'll hear about how that self-confidence and that lack of belief is part of my journey. And I just continue to realize it over and over again. But as I said, you end up where we are in life. So I'm grateful to be here now.
And that's the beautiful thing about life. It's really about the journey, not about the destination. And you meet great people along the way, and you learn new things, and you find ways to better yourselves. So it is give a point in life where you do some retrospective thinking to see, what is, but it's questions like that kind of help us with the next generation of podcasters or those who are struggling. I remember, and we talked about this last time, where there was a stat that on Apple Podcasts, about 70% of Apple Podcasts only have one episode.
Yeah.
And so there's people that have made the push to start doing something great to communicate with their communities, but then they kind of lose their fire, and they lose the will. So it really comes to just having what drives you, and then finding ways to keep yourself to keep moving. And for those, and I hope though that 70% of people find another way to pick themselves up, because they probably have a great story to tell. And just as you and your team have done 250 episodes of great stories, diversified topics, and very, very, very deep dives into very deep and very just going over. I made a tally list. Where's my Post-it note? I lost my Post-it note. But I went and started listening to different topics of what you and your team have come up with, and I'm just amazed in how well that you've been able to go in depth for these topics. So, Gareth,
yeah, and it's.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I really appreciate that, and and I want to share that's also a challenge. It's a balance, right? And we have to be aware that it can fill you up, but it's also super emotional. Like you can hear on the show the amount of time that I'm in tears when I'm listening to a story, and it stirs up stuff in me. So it can be it's a real balancing act. So I love to come on and share my story, chat to other podcasters, and just get out there as well. And that's really hard right now because we're in a bit of a struggle around the world, but get out there and just kind of listen and share my story a little bit, as well as being on the other end of it. Like I said, it's always that tipping the scale, because you need to fill fill that energy up. Sometimes it drains you, sometimes it depletes you, and sometimes it brings you up. And that might link into why, yeah, so those podcasts have got one episode, and maybe that's why people aren't finding that balance. So just do some kind of inside thinking. Those interpersonal conversations about where you need to put your energy is so important.
That's great. Gareth, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Is there anything you would like to add? And also, I'm sure we can find We As on Apple Podcasts and everyone's favorite podcast platform. But give us a couple ways on how we can follow you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can find us on any podcast platform. But if you also go to weas.ca, you can head over there. We've got just there's a host page there, but there's also a listen here page. You can just go on that tab, and actually all of our stuff is fed into the website. So you can pull it directly from there, and you can download as well from there. So that's another great place to find us. And then best place really where we do most of our kind of advertising our shows would be on Instagram. So it's we_as_start talking. And you can find us there. We're also on Facebook under the same handle, so you'll be able to check out everything we're up to. And they're really the places to connect. And me personally, if you want to connect with me, you can find me on Instagram. I'm pretty active on there, at Gareth_Nock, and I'm happy to connect on there. I post a lot of our stuff on there for the podcast, but also just a lot of my own personal stuff in the world of fitness. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit more or asking me any questions, I'm always happy to extend my fitness community out to the world as well.
Awesome, Gareth. Thanks very much for being on the show, and looking forward to your future episodes.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And just to, share a little gratitude as well. Thanks for having me on the show, coming on We As well, and just doing what you do, putting it out there, putting your amazing smile out there in the world, and, sharing your story, because it impacts everybody's life when we do that more. Everyone kind of shines their light in the world. It gives permission to others to do the same, and it lifts everybody up. So I appreciate you.
And I appreciate you. Thanks, Gareth.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for watching our video. If you want to learn more about WazaMedia, go to our main channel over here. And if you want to see more podcast episodes, go over here. See you next time.